Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of video analysis and deep dives into the English course. Today's lesson is on the subject of film, and what better film to start with than probably one of the most famous films of all time, certainly one of the highest grossing of all time, and that is Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Now, when we're looking at the analysis of this, we're going to be using things like cinematography, which is lighting, camera angles, script, how the angles are shot, what symbolism can we see from it, what we would call mise-en-scene, the use of scenery, and like everything else in the English literature, we're going to look at themes, language, characters and development, and what can we learn from that. So before we start, let's go into our deep dive, shall we? Now, remember, this film is 1982. So when you're describing your context, the fact it was released in 1982 is quite important. Okay? So, in American cinema, there would have been films like Alien that was released, and you would have had films like Star Wars. And what that would have done to the public consciousness of those who were going to see this in the cinema at the time is, because there wasn't an abundance of high budget alien extraterrestrial films, no pun intended, then people were accustomed to fear the unknown. That aliens were, I suppose, dangerous, deadly, detrimental to humanity. So, but 3 years after Alien came out and 5 years after Star Wars came out, the director, Steven Spielberg, had told us that, aliens could be cute and cuddly too, especially if they came in the form of the pot-bellied creatures like E.T. He was considered at the time when he was released to be adorable and wide-eyed, and this appearance was supposedly imagined after Steven Spielberg suggested that Albert Einstein's forehead and eyes should be superimposed or photoshopped in today's language onto the face of a baby. Hence, that's how we get E.T. Now, it's a sci-fi adventure for the whole family, and this was Steven Spielberg's homage, or in other words, tribute, to childhood and the innocence of it all. We have the story of a lonely little boy called Elliot who befriends the outer space being, and the outer space being E.T., who was left by his pals. Elliot introduces E.T. to customs such as how to communicate, how to drink beer, eat candy, and dress up in his little sister Gertie's clothes. Of course, their secret friendship can't last for long though, and soon the boy and his alien are under threat from government men wanting to experiment on the unfortunate intergalactic traveller. This was based on an idea Spielberg had nurtured for a while, and he related it to his screenwriters after he shot Raiders of the Lost Ark the year beforehand. And E.T. really works as, a happy adventure that appeals to the child in all of us, and it delivers a lot of what we would call sentimental moments that reminds the audience of their own childhood and allows them to feel a sense of nostalgia, feel a sense of happiness. And this sentimentality, appeals to us. It plays with our emotions, okay? But it also isn't too sugary sweet as a film because it's paced well, and that's another thing you can talk about, how pacing becomes important, how a film progresses. And there's a mixture of what we can look at. We see humour, and we see a bit of sadness in the script, okay? What you have then, you had E.T., we're talking about camera techniques, special effects. E.T., as well as being his voice, was a combination of a man and a woman trying to speak at the same time, and for the scenes where the creature was walking along, you often had a child or a small person in the E.T. suit. Now, what we're looking at when we talk about this as well is why this movie is so important and why we would study it and why it's worth studying. Okay? So we will look at themes, we will look at the characters and how it develops, and in particular attention with those who are studying for the junior cert, those who are being examined in it. If you're asked about a key scene, we will look at both the opening and the closing scene, because both those scenes are brilliant for covering our sense of, I suppose, what we're trying to aim for and what we're trying to achieve. Now, if you have a copy of the film on DVD, or if you have a copy of the film that you can find on download, and you want to watch it along with this, you can do, because as I said, we're going through the video and we're going through the key scenes. The exact timestamps are on it, so when you need to find a certain scene in the DVD or find a certain scene in the version that you're viewing, you'll be able to find it like this. Okay, now with the screenplay and how Steven Spielberg uses camera and use of design, he has techniques here. First of all, like slow, deliberate lighting. So these are things we watch before we go into the key scenes. So we have slow and deliberate lighting, and Spielberg is a master of this. So what it does is it creates a sense of wonder. It creates a sense of humanity. You have this deliberate lighting. You have the use of music, or to put it in the film terms, the score. Excuse the bad writing. Is used to signify this too. So when you're talking about movie, you have to talk about music. This creates a sense of wonder. Just think of that theme tune and what it does, and helps us bring the characters, the action, and the themes itself full circle. So this movie begins with a strong sense of fear and dread. You know, no matter what Steven Spielberg film you'll watch, he uses horror in all his films, and it's used in these extended scenes of darkness after the alien spaceship lands on Earth and dispatches the extraterrestrial and accidentally leaves him behind. You know, the alien, who's largely unseen at the start of the film, finds his way into a suburban, and this is where the film is set, so suburban California. And he ends up in this suburban California household in the shed, where we have the middle child of a broken home, who's Elliot in this case, notices a disturbance. So if you're talking about this with regards to Spielberg's other movies and how a director puts his stamp on a script and puts his stamp on the film, Spielberg uses, I suppose, the disturbance to be noticed by the small child, in this case Elliot, to make it seem more important, but also at the same time to make it seem subtle. That only a child with a sense of wonder and a sense of that he hasn't had the time to become cynical would notice this. And the fact that the child discovers it rather than an adult or anyone else also shows that when you're in childhood, when something is new to you, it can often seem unsettling and scary if you don't understand it. So this gives the film a sense of legitimacy because he's frightened by the strange alien. Okay? But with it, and again it's no pun, that E.T. himself is alienated. Okay? But also, what we will see, this theme of alienation, Elliot is also. Because while it's easy enough to be alienated from something you don't understand or something you're unfamiliar with, you can be, alienated from familiar things too. So Elliot is alienated from the familiar, and our example of that is our family, or his family. Now, his mother is still adjusting to divorce, and his older brother is cruel and reckless. You know, young freckle-faced Elliot has his own reasons to be drawn to an alien in spite of all these risks. You know, Elliot is, like E.T., kind of a wide-eyed child who has the enter sign on the door of his room. So that enter sign, again, is symbolic. It isn't accidental. A clue that he's actively seeking friendship or looking for something to come into his life. Simply, in the perfect scenes of two young males earning the trust of each other. That's what Elliot and E.T. are doing. They're trading, and we can see this when E.T. witnesses Elliot's decision to run from an authority figure. And when he does this, both the boy, Elliot himself, and E.T. bond with each other. And this bond is important because it first seals itself further when they begin to sleep. It's as if the pair can only really deeply find peace because they found one another. Of course, the alien's suddenly a fugitive from the United States government, and the boy has gone rogue and missing from his own family because his own family at this stage had alienated him. Okay, this idea of familiar, this idea of family, because they'd mocked him and they had repelled him. So you see how this loops around. Okay, so From there, E.T. will take the friendship to a higher level, as Elliot tutors his new friend, whom he selfishly conceals from his siblings, his mother, and everyone else, by first explaining to E.T. that he's human, that he's a boy, and then that he's Elliot. So, hidden in Elliot's room, we see him with posters, comics, and figures, such as there's the Incredible Hulk, there's Buck Rogers, and you see Lando Calrissian from Star Wars. Okay? Now, again, the Hulk is seen as an outsider. Buck Rogers and Lando Calrissian are dealing with space, time travel, all different stuff that is beyond our comprehension, and that again is symbolic. So we can talk about that use of scenes. But E.T. in there refuels, recharges, and he overcomes all his fear too through Elliot's sense of life. Okay, and all of this joy and all of this enlightenment coming from the boy's bedroom finally makes the middle child the centre of the family home, sort of bringing the broken home back together, as Elliot, who's found this new confidence, is kind of feeling recharged and rejuvenated as his friend, has finally asserted himself in his life for his first time, that Elliot finally has something that's truly his. Like, he takes his younger sister Gertie and later his older brother into his confidence, so that he trusts them to see what he sees, and he trusts them to meet E.T. Though their mom is still too caught up and self-absorbed into her new single life to appreciate her growing children and the problems that comes when children are maturing and they're growing. So the mom doesn't even have time to revel in how intelligent her son is and how independent and how much of an individual he's becoming. Okay? And you can see this in the different key sequences that we have here. So the first one is the opening scene itself, which when you're watching is the first 8 minutes. You have the final scenes, which is about from an hour 24 to an hour 54 into it. So that lasts 30 or 40 minutes or so when it kicks off. And then, within itself, breaking that down further, we're looking at the lab from around an hour 24 to the famous ship scene from an hour 39 into it. So you're looking at the key elements of the film. You're looking at the cinematography. So cinematography is basically defined, guys, as the art of photography and the camera work itself in filmmaking. So, as you're doing this as English students and English literature, you're taught to look for themes. You're taught to, I suppose, through poems and novels and plays, visually it's the picture you paint in your head, and it's the words that are on the page in black and white is what you have to interpret and what you have to work around. Well, here in cinematography, that adds an extra element and an extra dimension, that a film isn't just a fantastic form of entertainment, but film is also important in how it tells a story. And we look at the cinematography in the opening scene. So, if you're watching along, start going from 0 to 8 minutes, and if you're not, and if you have seen the film before, just imagine this as we're going through the notes. So we have this opening shot of the stars, slowly panning down to Earth, which symbolises E.T. landing on our planet. The tracking shots, and again, that what I mean when I say tracking shots, the following shots across the Earth and the interior of the ship demonstrate that we aren't different. Okay, the camera has a low angle, and it positions us from the point of view of E.T., that we're at the same eye level, that we can relate to E.T. and the other curious little creatures. And again, to get our sense of, I suppose, trepidation and that sense of danger that we talked about early on, the tracking shots also cautiously, and that's done by slowly circle the ship. So we decide then as an audience if they're a threat. And as the camera gradually pans closer and closer to the aliens, until, just then, we as the audience have decided that E.T. and the aliens themselves are friendly. But notice, the camera isn't just telling a story, it's also reflecting our point of view. There's plenty of point of view shots, again, as E.T. will gaze and wonder at the trees and the town, and how we as an audience all of a sudden get his sense of wonderment as the achievements of man and Earth. So he's looking at this through the eyes of a toddler. So it's the same way, guys, that E.T. is designed off the shape and body of a baby, in a way, that everything's new to him. There's another symbolism with the design of the character. And we then see the close-up of even the keys indicate that we see an authority figure with the knowledge but that the keys unlock the mystery that give us the secret. But all of a sudden, this cautiousness, this sense of wonderment is changed because the camera gets very, very aggressive. And as the car starts zooming past, these aggressive close-ups juxtapose. Okay, now there's our new word of the day. We have juxtaposition. So, the juxtaposition is the fact of two things being seen or placed close together with contrasting effect. So we have gone from the peacefulness of E.T. seeing the wonderment of the world for the first time with that juxtaposition, or that contrast, of the original gentle cinematography as the cars are coming at him now aggressively, that there's no time to sit down. And this juxtaposition is used to establish the peaceful aliens without telling us anything about the aliens themselves, or without the aliens uttering a single word. We see this juxtaposition because we see this contrast, how life and humanity can be aggressive, zooming past, uncaring, not taking time to think, always going on to the next level. The aliens have a much slower, much more peaceful way of life. There's the bright blue and white light from the headlights of the cars, jarringly kind of bleaches out the whole screen. Look back at the alien craft as it lands. You have that warm, soft, hearty glow, like a fireplace that is welcoming, as opposed to the blue and white lights that you can't catch flashing, which is almost meant to startle you, to dazzle you, to blind you. And then the camera pans out again with these long shots, which show how small E.T. is in context of the rest of the world and in contrast to the rest of the world, and it gives us that feeling of the small thing is isolation. He's lonely. And again, because this is 1982, as well as telling a story, it was also showing how good the special effects were for the time. If we're talking about cinematography in the final scene, and again, any film studies question that you will get often asks you to look at the film techniques in relation to one scene. So you don't need to have both scenes, but it's just your own personal preference or how you want to explain it. So we're going to look at the final scene as well, and how cinematography tells us a story and tells us more about the story and even adds to it without saying anything extra off the script. So, there's that juxtaposition again between the artificial lighting of the lab. It's shocking, it's almost too unnaturally bright, it's unsettling, it's unnerving. Okay, we can't feel comfortable, we can't relax in this weird artificial light, same way E.T. can't. And contrast that with the natural light of the moon and the stars in the forest, which leads the audience, to mistrust authority and the systems in the adult world in favour of the natural surroundings that connote or that you associate with childhood. In this lab scene, there's the he comes to me moment, where the rushing moment at around an hour and 27 minutes, where the camera slowly tracks towards Elliot as the panicking adults try to revive E.T. So again, we're looking at it from Elliot's point of view. And during that time when E.T. dies, we see Mary stepping into focus, and all of the Earth family, or in other words, Elliot's family, are reunited. And the light is coming down from above, and it creates the halo effect as they embrace. So that halo, that ray of light around their heads, as you see it, that's almost coming down from above, that it's this heavenly, that it's this perfect divine thing. That it's almost like the gods and the heavens themselves want this to happen. And around an hour and a half into the film, you see E.T. has died. So the blinds are drawn and the light floods in through the blinds, and it creates what's called that Venetian blind effect. Okay? So imagine you see the blinds at home, or if you have Venetian blinds, and they're drawn and little rays of light come through, but it's used to keep the light out. You see darkness more often than not. And look at that shot. Okay? Turn those Venetian blinds sideways, and if you have them vertical instead of horizontal, they're prison bars. It's entrapment. It's the idea that not the full light is coming in, that you're still behind some barrier, still behind some wall, that you're entrapped, either emotionally or physically. And then at 1:43, you get that iconic visual here of Elliot and E.T. flying past the setting sun. And again, at the time, this is every child's fantasy action adventure. Flight, aliens, extraterrestrial beings. Okay? The boys are now gifted with the magical powers of the alien that they've been trusting of ET, and has rewarded them in the same effect, because he realizes how humans are inherently and genuinely nice. And this famous long shot allows the audience again to look at the special effects and to marvel at how impressive they are. So I suppose that's the joy of film. It teaches you what can be done with camera, the illusions, the techniques, the effect, but also how those effects can add more to the story. And 5 minutes later, you get a series of intimate close-ups as Elliot and E.T. say their tear-jerking or their emotional goodbyes. Now, we also have mise-en-scene. But, just to go back for a minute, this domestic setting, with government, okay? The government is E.T.'s villain in the film as much as there can be a villain in E.T. While the government is in the background for most of the movie, that it's not really prominent, the threat of the state against the friendship creeps out in the first scenes at school. So you see the bulletin board about extinction and a teacher who remains essentially unseen. So it's that the adults aren't important here, that everyone else isn't important, that you don't see the teachers, you don't see anyone else in that scene, that it's all about Elliot. Okay? But thinking of that, the idea of extinction, Elliot experiences a kind of telepathic communication with E.T. and his friend back in the room. And we see this because this entails Elliot's dog, a can of beer, and a clip of the movie The Quiet Man. And the mayhem that sets off when they kind of telepathically connect leads to Elliot's coming of age moment. It leads to his moment of maturity. So, in a sense, the teacher's giving him this instruction about cutting the frog. The teacher says, locate the heart and notice that it's still beating. So Elliot gains a new appreciation and a new humanity for living things in that biology class. So that moment when E.T. and Elliot meld minds together, it keeps the heart beating. It keeps both of them going. And this is one of the key emblems of E.T., is that what makes a heart beat is love and affection. This love and affection, this beating heart, is what keeps you alive. And we can see that in E.T. later on, quite literally, with the glowing heart scene. Okay? That's the theme. How love keeps you alive. Now, to go back, and we're looking at what we call mise-en-scene. So mise-en-scene is a French word, and it's the arrangement of scenery, props, lighting, etc. on the stage of a theatrical production or on the stage of a film. And, there's various different elements to mise-en-scene. You have the setting, you have the decoration, the lighting, the depth of space, how far the camera is back, how close the camera is to the scene, costumes, makeup, all these props. But together, mise-en-scene, literally the use of the scene, or what can the scene and what can the background tell us? What can the camera capture that tells us more about the characters, either subtly or through more obvious means? So we see mise-en-scene in the opening scene through the introduction of mankind itself, that people are loud, they're noisy, they're obnoxious. The idea itself that we can see the dirty exhaust, that if you want to look at it even more literally and even in more of a modern context, the way people are damaging their own habitat, damaging their own environment. The cars are aggressive, the people are disruptive, and they're not respectful of nature. Running through the puddles, ploughing our cars through the forest, literally taking Mother Nature for granted and destroying all around us, because we're humans, we're the most powerful things on earth, and it's a message of that's all that matters. Whereas in contrast, E.T., he's the juxtaposition here. He delicately digs up a plant by being watched by a bunny. The fact that a bunny rabbit is watching E.T. looking after a plant and minding a plant shows us that he's not a threat. And E.T. respects our world, that E.T. respects all living things. And that's best seen in, again, with a bunny. A bunny can't talk. A bunny can't tell us words. He's not afraid of him though. So why should we be, if we're meant to be the most advanced living beings on this planet? So it's the question, why is the bunny smarter than us, or why is the bunny more intuitive than us? E.T. is only interested in the plant. E.T. is only interested in the planet itself, and with that regards, E.T. is drawn to the town, the suburbs in California, and he's drawn to the humanity itself. Going back to it, and we keep mentioning this as a common theme, and it's a really, really powerful image, is how the hearts of the aliens glow when they hear the owls hooting. The owls hooting again, and warns and checks the group is okay. It's clear then by the heart glowing and the heart beating that E.T. sees all these harmless creatures or anything that contributes to the peace and serenity of mankind as family. I mentioned earlier here, the design of E.T. is similar to that of a toddler. It's the waddle, the small round body, and the large emotive eyes. This promotes a maternal response in the audience. For want of a better word, it's the awe factor. That he's cute, that you want to look at him, that you want to pet him. You have E.T.'s childlike being a sense of wonder that everything's new to him. We're looking at it essentially, the world from E.T.'s point of view, as the world from the point of view of a child. And what's also a little sound effect and a little effect at the time was E.T.'s walk and his distinctive waddle. The sound of that was a wet t-shirt filled with jelly. Again, just use the special effects and techniques at the time. Now, we're looking again at the idea of the mise-en-scene in the closing scene. So, there's again the juxtaposition which we talked about in cinematography too. So, cinematography points out juxtapositions in mise-en-scene and in the story itself of the idea of the man-made lab, which is confining, uncomfortable, meant to harm. A white building like that, this white mise-en-scene, contrasting, as we said, that natural beauty of the forest. Elliot's costume in the lab scenes is ghostly, angelic and pure. That again, he's harmless, that he is the most simple, and I mean simple as in he has no misconceptions, he has no hate, he's just cares about his friend. So it's ghostly, angelic and pure in that way. And you see Elliot and Keyes often mirror each other within the frame and within the shot, as if they are, father and son, or if they're a version of Elliot and a version of his future himself. And you can see that with Elliot and Keyes. Now, again, if you're watching the DVD or if you're watching a film version, I can put the clip up here due to copyright on YouTube because we don't want our video to be taken down. But at 1:39, E.T. emerges from the van in a cloud of white smoke, wearing a white robe with his red heart glowing. Here's the shot here. And this is, again, this ethereal, this angelic image. Elliot then puts on the red hoodie, and it's, again, this metaphor with the red hoodie, the red heart. E.T. and Elliot are connected. Same thing as wearing your team colours, or who you're linked to. And our family. The children evade the adults with their cars and guns, knocking the lights off the police cars about 2 minutes later. As again, it doesn't matter what the adults tell us or what the adults want to do, that there is a way for the younger generation, the new generation, to change the outcome, to change the outlook of the world. That just because those who've gone before us have said something has to be done a certain way, doesn't mean that we have to accept it if there is a better way. And then, 7 minutes later, at this famous final goodbye scene, you see E.T. again bathed in that white heavenly light. That he's innocent, that he's pure, that he's good, as he and Elliot embrace, and Elliot looks to Mary, and we can see that he's decided to stay with his Earth family. But he speaks the words, and lovely again if you're looking for quotes, "I'll be right here." Now, E.T. symbolises Elliot's childhood dreams and desires, that even though he's leaving, these emotions will always remain in Elliot, so that Elliot will always be a part of E.T., and what E.T. will always be a part of Elliot. Elliot's final moments in the film are stoic, heroic and hopeful. The last we see of E.T. is an hour and 50 minutes in. It's his red heart beating as the ship's door closes around him, and we're reminded of the film's final message of love and family, and that no matter where they are, that no one ever truly leaves us. Okay? So it's edited well. We talked about it when we look around how editing is important, what the camera can tell us. Okay? In the opening scene, what we call a cross dissolves, and they used to imply the passing of time. So again, without telling us, we can see time developing and time passing on. In the final scene, you see all of a sudden rapid, quick editing, as E.T. dies, which tells us about, the sadness and the confusion of a child confronting death. And then now we're in 42 into it, we get the closer and closer shots of Elliot's reaction to the blockage, and the closer and closer it goes into Elliot's face, it allows us to read that panic and fear more and more. Sound. We have the clear flute in innocent sound, there's nothing else complicating it. That flute is just the one sound on its own, almost whistling against the backdrop of stars. It's hope, it's purity, it's wonder, it's simplicity, it's innocence. But again, the sounds of the forest then are natural. That you have the crickets singing, and you have the owls. And now, what they did with the sound is they enhanced it, and they would have turned up the volume on the owls and the cricket sounds just to enhance it and to emphasise the point more about the connection with nature. Compare that to the aggressive sound of the cars and the dangling keys. The creatures themselves, the aliens, have a kind of a pleasing purr, almost like a cat, so the audience can recognise them as pet-like and therefore not a threat. It's that maternal instinct that makes it appealing to them. And it's also that toddler image, that maternal image, because when he's in distress, E.T. screams like a baby. And he treats that inherent, or activates that inherent maternal, or if you're a male watching this, that paternal instinct to look after him. Same way we would with a pet or a child, or even a sibling. Just our only desire is to protect this creature. And this is the final scene then. You have the famous musical score written by John Williams, one of the most famous composers ever made. That in the heart of these final scenes, it anchors the action to a repeated musical motif or musical theme that leads our emotion response. That we have the same melody for fear, for hope, for sadness, for release, and in a way, in elation. Okay? So, and what I have inserted into the link again is the final score, the video to John Williams' music that you can listen to and realise and understand how that works. Now, the themes of this. Obviously enough, we have the themes of family. We have what you call the broken family at the start, that the mom and dad aren't living together, so time and custody split. Elliot doesn't want to be with his mother. He feels his mother has alienated and neglected him, and Mary herself is struggling to cope with her 3 children, to cope with her new reality. So the mise-en-scene in this case, and think of the toys and everything around the place and how it's designed, it symbolises chaos. So everything's chaotic and cramped, but again, it's full of toys, it's full of all items for the children. She's showing that despite everything, despite all the problems that the mom and the dad might be having, that it is loving and it's full of toys. And what we have here at the time, you see what's called consumerism. So it would have been one of the first movies to properly go into the idea of what's called product placement. And product placement is basically companies would pay films to have their items advertised or used within the film. At the family dinner scene at around the 17-minute mark, the adventure of Elliot and Elliot talking about this adventure brings the family together, and it shows Elliot's mature as he has to look after his own pet, or his own human, or whatever, or his own living being, as it says. So first of all, again, we see this idea of this maturity, and we see how Elliot now has this new understanding and this new respect. The women in this film are just non-existent in terms of a team. It's a one-sided minority. Men and boys drive and force on the action, and female characters, of which there are only 2, are seen as an annoyance or an obstacle to be overcome. So the way Gertie seems to be in the way because she's young and she's inexperienced and she doesn't know what's going on for a lot of it. Or, the case at this stage, Elliot's relationship with his mom is an obstacle at some stage. But also, it has a positive view of the future. That contrast to what we would have seen, or what audiences would have seen in the cinemas beforehand, with the likes of Alien and the likes of Star Wars, that the aliens aren't a threat, that they're peaceful, adorable creatures. Kind of like the Ewoks, those teddy bears in the Star Wars sequels that would have come out later. But the possibilities of space travel are endless and exciting, not to be feared. So this is still within maybe 10 years after the last moon landing. So the idea of colonising space and travelling on in space wasn't that far off. Sci-fi was big business in the early 1980s. A lot of the big highest grossing films would have been the likes of Star Wars, would have been the likes of Alien, would have been the likes of the Star Trek films, which would have been still being made at the time, so that it's about this possibility of the final frontier and what that brings to us. And the historical context of this is important, that we know that this is now set in what was called post-Vietnam USA. Now, Vietnam War, as you know, divided American society nearly down the middle. That there was distrust of the government, that there was still a fear in 1982 of Russia and communism defeating democracy, or that the communists taking over the country, or taking over the known world, or being seen as the superpower. There was this impression to a number of Americans that if America did not protect the world in their role as the policemen of the world, or if the guardians of the world, then the whole world will fall to communism. So, in a way, the government is kind of a villain in the eyes of the film, because they don't act, in the best interest of everyone, because we know E.T. is harmless, but the government here, because they don't understand it, or they can't relate to it, want to destroy it. Okay? It's one of these easy, I suppose, again, like we were saying earlier, that the children have the power to change the future. That just because the adults or the older establishment or the man says something's wrong doesn't necessarily mean that it is. Okay? There's a lovely soulfulness, what we call a secular soulfulness to this film. So when we say secular, we're saying non-religious. So the film has a soul. The film shows love without getting too religious or religious at all, and shows love in both the physical form and, I suppose, the fact of the higher, heavenly image with the use of lighting. That theme of the heart light. And another thing that you should notice before we go on with the historical context of post-Vietnam USA is, in this film, there's a lovely technique, okay, that we call the 2-point illustration. So, 2-point illustration is when you have 2 points of view, or when a film parallels another story and echoes and mirrors this other story. And the one here is Peter Pan. Okay? And you can see that is when the mom reads Peter Pan to Gertie. Now, again, we could just said the director or the writers could have used any bedtime story to read to Gertie, but they're using Peter Pan, and that's important. It activates that sense of childlike belief that shows, the relationship between the mother and daughter. Peter Pan also is a story about an angry boy who has imaginary friends, who curls, up and falls asleep and wakes up as a different kind of enchanted hero. And the most obvious example, or the most obvious, I suppose, reference to Peter Pan in a way, is here, the most famous image from the film itself. If we go back to the famous moon scene and the bike. Okay? The two friends fly by moonlight, come back around as E.T. rolls around in the boy's bicycle. He allows Elliot to fly through with the sky, and also backed by the other band of bicycles following them into the colours of the rainbow. Now, that's symbolic of Peter Pan and the Lost Boys flying around the moon and flying through the sky. That Peter Pan helps them, and Peter Pan I suppose brings joy and this surreal love into their life that might have been missing here. The metaphor of the sunflower and the metaphor of the plant also, just like everything, talks about the circle of life and death. But I digress. Back to our historical context here of post-Vietnam USA. People were distrusting of the government. Okay, people felt that the Vietnam War was unnecessary and that it was for nothing. So this film is one of the first post-Vietnam films that shows American society and how it's trying to heal itself. The USA is shrugging off this disillusionment and is now in a new era in the 1980s of prosperity. Okay? Hence, that's seen through the consumerism. When you go back and watch the film, look at all the toys, look at all those presents. Authority, though, is still seen to be a threat to all that at an hour and 17 into it. That authority and adulthood aren't necessarily to be trusted. Now, how do you describe the narrative? So the narrative is how the study is told. Now, there's a heavy use of enigma codes in the opening scene to confuse us that we're not sure what's going on. And the film is fairly straightforward in its narrative and how the story is laid out and planned out. It's what's called the classical Hollywood narrative. It's classical Hollywood, it's because the majority of Hollywood films, from the formation of Hollywood in the early 20th century up to now, has followed the same way through. That you have the happy ending and a clear resolution for the audience. That it's easy to understand what happened. That there's no confusion. That there's no open ending. That everything is definite and final. And also, I suppose there's clear opposites in this film. The idea of youth versus authority, trust versus distrust, the idea of the government versus the people. And then you look at the genre. So when you're talking about your film and you're talking about your scene and techniques, another key thing is how do you identify the film? What do you recognise the film as? And the type of film, when we talk about this, is genre. So sci-fi is obviously enough the genre of ET. It's about extraterrestrial. It is a science fiction film. But this, as we said, was a very popular genre in the 1980s. Okay? As space travel became more and more prevalent and more in the news, all of a sudden, the final frontier, space, became more and more real. The idea of colonization, the idea of being able to travel to space became more and more realistic. And that brought both its dangers and its opportunities. So Spielberg had originally directed Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was his first sci-fi film, and Return of the Jedi was released a year later in 1983. The Empire Strikes Back was released in 1980. Star Wars was released in 1977. We had 3 Star Trek films by that stage. So sci-fi was very, very profitable in Hollywood. And the film uses many of the kind of themes and conventions and structure of sci-fi. It's the what if. So it's taking things that we can't know the answer for sure, like as in what if an alien came to Earth, and the different codes and techniques. So it shows us how the special effects play into this. Okay? Naturally enough, if a film is science fiction, it's going to have a lot more special effects, and as an audience, you're going to appreciate the special effects a lot more, and because you know it's science fiction, you're going to be more accepting of special effects in it for that reason. And this cinema then, and this film, allows the audience to have a safe place where they can experience fear, or they can experience uncertainty, or they can experience all of these emotions for an hour or two, and then, once the lights go up, once the film ends, it's back to the reality of daily life. Okay? So, thanks for listening, guys. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe so you'll never miss a notification when these videos go up. And I'll be back with more deep dives and analysis into films, poetry, language, Latin, history and everything else real soon. Goodbye.